present to everyone. And now, oh, whoops, I gotta hit one more button. There's like 10 buttons you gotta click to actually make this work. Oh, no, okay, it's broadcasting, never mind. Good deal. Minimize that. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping that we do at the beginning of all the DevICT talks is go through what's coming up on the DevICT lineup. Java Talks is part of DevICT. It's not a completely separate thing. We just wanted to talk about Java more often than we could with their Thursday night tech talks. So this program is ran by Make ICT members. You go to makeict.org, check them out. This is about us, community of developers. We do have a code of conduct, so if you feel like somebody's in violation of that code of conduct, you can be sure and let somebody at DevICT know so that we can take care of that ASAP. Ways you can get involved. We chat daily on Slack. You can get an invite for Slack on devict.org. There's past presentations, and then we also post jobs. We don't charge for membership or anything, but there is a monthly recurring fee of around $100 or $120 rather. So any donations are appreciated to just help cover some server costs and different things like that. You can give a talk. A lot of times people, including myself, will give talks about something we don't know a lot about. It kind of forces us to learn that particular topic. Or if you're going to be speaking at a professional conference or something like that, it's good practice. So just letting us know on Slack that you want to give a talk, and then we get things scheduled. We have a lot of different friends in the tech community that are not necessarily part of DevICT, but definitely involved with all of them, and the list is there. This is the upcoming schedule. So Code Coffees every Thursday morning. We have study hall in the evenings, the Labor Party. Hangouts are usually at the Labor Party, but sometimes they can be somewhere else. And then they have a game dev potluck, which that spawned off of the game jam. It's just a little more frequently than the game. It's like a very, very teeny tiny game jam is basically what that is. Java Talks are every third Tuesday. There's a .NET night. It's every third Thursday. And then the DevICT Presents, which is the kind of the flagship tech talk, is the last Thursdays at the Labor Party. And then usually there's a dev lunch the following day. We do have a mentorship program, which kind of got revamped and rejuvenized. So there's, if you go to devict.org/mentors, you can see what mentors are available and what technologies or different things that they are available to mentor in. And then you can get connected with them. I'm on that list as well. And then, you know, it's setting up times of, do we meet for code and coffee, or do we meet at the Labor Party, or do you want to go out to lunch? And it's kind of a free thing that we just kind of offer to help people get better at their tech stuff. And then tonight, obviously, is the Java talk for creating REST APIs with Grails. So let's just move right into that, unless anybody has any questions specifically about DevICT. None whatsoever. All right. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about creating REST APIs with Grails. So a little bit about me. Most of you already know who I am, but I'm a software engineer, architect at here at High Touch. I was a software engineering consultant for the last 7 years prior to being here, and give or take 15 years experience in software development, kind of across the gambit of all different technology stacks. Also an avid tabletop gamer. I run a local community group called Cardboard Carnage. We do tabletop games and stuff. Cardboard Carnage. Yeah. And then I have a blog that I never update at gregbolinger.com. And right. And then that's I'm primarily on Twitter, especially tech-related stuff on Twitter. So that's my Twitter handle. So what is Grails? This is a blatant copy and paste from the Grails website, because I don't think I could have said it better myself. Grails is a powerful web framework for the Java platform aimed at multiplying developers' productivity thanks to convention over configuration, sensible defaults, and opinionated APIs. Integrates smoothly with JVM, allowing you to immediately be immediately productive whilst providing powerful features, including integrated ORM, which is object relational mapping, domain-specific languages, runtime and compile time metaprogramming, and asynchronous programming. And then the website is grails.org. So Grails guts. If you spilled the cup that is Grails, what would fall out of it is Spring Framework. And Grails is technically built on top of Spring Boot now as a version 3 dot something. It's all built on top of Spring Boot. It contains JPA and Hibernate for the object relational mapping by default. It's built on top of the Groovy language, so everything we do in Grails will be written in Groovy. Uses Gradle for its build system, and it has an extensive plugin ecosystem. Pretty much everything about Grails is a plugin. Even the various core bits of Grails are plugins to Grails. Who's using Grails? Again, I completely stole this off the website. Kind of notably up there is Netflix. Uses Grails heavily, especially internally. Best Buy, MTV, MasterCard, etc., IBM, Google. LinkedIn uses Grails probably as much as Netflix uses Grails. And this is not an exhaustive list, obviously, just kind of some names that most people would recognize in the industry. Where have I used Grails? I'm talking about it, so hopefully I've used it a little bit, right? So there was a project I was part of for rebuilding Manning Publications, which is a online tech book publishing company. We rebuilt their entire backend infrastructure in Grails. Another company out of Chicago named ESCO, we built a document registry application for the state of California, all in Grails. In, what was it, 2015, the last half of 2015, I consulted for a company out of Omaha. It's an insurance company, and they were modernizing everything they had into Grails. And then a startup that I was a part of for many years, GenRocket, is completely done in Grails in terms of the web platform. The engine is completely written in Groovy, and the command line interface is completely written in Groovy. So some things that I'm not going to cover in depth in this talk, because Grails is almost an ecosystem in and of itself, and there's a lot of moving parts. And I obviously couldn't cover all those moving parts in a single talk, so we're going to really focus in on today's talk. I'm not going to go over in depth anything about the Groovy language except as it relates to Grails and explaining what's happening in Grails. Again, these could all be just their own standalone talks. I'm not going to talk in depth about the Gradle build system, but you'll see it, how it's used in a couple of places. Grails uses Spock. It's a specification framework for unit testing built on top of JUnit. I'm going to show how to write tests, but I'm not going to get into the idiosyncrasies of Spock itself. I'm going to use IntelliJ IDEA for the editor. And again, I could talk about IntelliJ for weeks, but I'm not going to do that tonight. We're just going to use it. And although we are building a REST API, and I will touch on a couple of minor things, I'm not going to dive deeply into REST architecture, HTTP, the HTTP verbs, request response, all that stuff. That's a fairly complex, deep conversation. So the next thing is we're going to move straight into live coding. Ask questions as you guys think of them. Go ahead and interrupt me. It's not a big deal, and ask any questions you have along the way. If I don't see you, say something, because I don't necessarily guarantee my peripheral will work as I'm writing code and trying to concentrate and not mess up. So we're going to dive right in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, well, how do I get Grails? So there's a couple of ways. One way is to just download it from the website. Latest version is 3.2.3. I'm actually going to be writing the demo code in 3.2.1. There weren't any majorly significant changes. I just didn't want to risk breaking something that I already knew worked. So we're going to stick with 3.2.1. But you can download it here and put it somewhere on your computer, and then put the binary in your path, and then you just type Grails. It's just a command line interface. Type Grails from somewhere and do some work, and you'll see how we do that in a little bit. The easiest way, if you're on anything but Windows, is to use SDKman. So SDKman is kind of like RVM, it's kind of like Node, NPM. if you're familiar with those, it's basically a command line interface for managing a bunch of different Java technologies, including Grails. The nice thing about SDKman is I can have multiple versions of Grails running in my computer and easily switch between versions of the command line to do whatever I need to do with the different versions. And that includes a bunch of other APIs as well, but primarily I use it for Grails and Groovy and Gradle. So that's what I recommend if you're not on Windows. If you're on Windows right now, the only way to do it is just download Grails and put it in your path. So let's talk a little bit about the Grails command line interface. So again, if I just type Grails and say version, so Grails is installed, and it's version 3.2.1. If I type SDK list Grails, so this is using SDKman, it lists all the versions available for Grails, and you can see that because of the little greater than sign, I have this version installed. Well, the star means I have it installed. The greater than sign means it is currently the default version if I just type Grails on the command line. So if I wanted to install a different version, I could say, oops, not Grails, already messing up, SDK install Grails 3.2.3, for example. And that will pull down and install Grails, and then when it's done, it'll ask me, do you want this to be your default? And I can say yes or no. And if I want to change, I can say use Grails 3.2. whatever, or whatever version, and it will switch on the command line to using that version of Grails. So definitely recommend SDKman if you're going to use it on a non-Windows machine. Grails has a lot of different commands that you can use in order to create apps and create plugins, create profiles, all sorts of different things. Primary thing we're going to look at today is create app and also list profiles. So if we say Grails list profiles, actually let's do this first. So if I just type Grails, this is another cool thing about the command line interface. It's going to give me a Grails shell, and then it will autocomplete, so I don't have to remember to type everything. Kind of nice. And if you're doing a bunch of Grails tasks, it's also faster because I don't have to bootstrap the Grails system every single time. So if I say list profiles, these are all the different profiles you can use to create a Grails app. The default is going to be a web profile for web applications. There's the Angular profile, REST API, Angular 2. There's actually a React profile now. I just haven't upgraded to the latest version of Grails, but there's a profile for creating React apps that are along with the Grails system. And what we're going to talk about today is we're creating REST APIs. So obviously, we're probably going to use the REST API profile. So if I said, I say profile info and REST API, it will actually tell me the provided features that come along with that particular profile. So this is a whole list of commands that are available. Most of these are available for all of the profiles, but and then there's a few provided features that you may want, etc. So that's basically how looking at the different profiles and what they do work. The reason we want to do a REST API, or not the reason we want to do REST API, the reason we're using the REST API profile is obviously because we are creating a REST API. And a few things that is important about that is you're not going to get all the HTML view rendering stuff that normally comes with Grails by default, because we're not rendering HTML. We're actually just rendering JSON or XML or something like that. It's also going to make the web application stateless. Most REST APIs are stateless. That's kind of part of what REST APIs are. Stateless basically means you're not storing any session data on the server. Every request, as far as the REST API is concerned, is a brand new request from who knows who, and it's up to the client to send all that information every single time to the server, so the server can just say, okay, and let me validate who you are or what you're doing every single time before it actually turns any work. And so that's what we want, obviously, out of the REST API. So we are going to, I'm just going to exit this, and I'm going to do it using the Grails command. So we're going to create an app. The app we're going to play around with today is, there's been a lot of gaming and Comic-Con and all sorts of different conventions that are getting really popular in Wichita. So we're going to create a very limited API on managing convention information, conventions, events, different things like that. So we're just going to call this Con API. So create app, and then the name of whatever the application is. This is very, Railsy type stuff and different frameworks like that just have the command line interface to create new apps. Ember does this. There's a React CLI that does this, an Angular CLI that does this. But then we need to tell it to use a specific profile, and we're going to say REST API. All right, so created it, and if we do a list, you can see we have a new folder called Con API. And if we go into that folder and do an ls, you can see we have the basic Grails structure for the application. So that this will be a little more visibly appealing, I'm going to go ahead and open this up in IntelliJ. So I'm skipping some IntelliJ setting up bits here because I don't want us to get completely lost in translation of the goal of the talk here. The project, yeah, I'm just importing the project. All right, so I'm going to move this. I was going to move this. I'm going to try that again. There we go. All right, so if we look over here now, you see we have the basic structure of the application. The main place where most of your work is going to be done is going to be in the Grails app folder. So Grails is an MVC framework at its heart, so model view controller. So we have a controllers folder where we're going to obviously put our controllers. Domains are going to be the objects that represent the tables in our database. And that's basically the models. The views in this case are actually, since it's a REST API, is going to be JSON or XML, depending on what you're trying to build for, where it defaults to JSON, but we can easily switch to XML, and I'll kind of show you how that works in a little bit. There's some other folders in here, which we'll kind of get to as we dig into the application a little bit more. I said at the beginning that it does use a Gradle build system, so that's what this Gradle file is for, or Maven or something like that, but it's just managing all the dependencies for the project and has all the commands to actually build and compile and do all that fun stuff. Let's see here. So the one thing we do want to do, which is a little weird in the build.grade file, is they have this group. When we create things, it's going to create packages. So for example, right now it created a package called Con API. I'm going to undo this. So we have a package Con API, and then we have some code in here. I'm actually going to change this, the com.con API, because that's a little more what we want in terms of a package name. And I want to go ahead and do that, but I am going to run the application now. So when we run a Grails application, we're basically doing a Grails run app. In IntelliJ, this is doing that for us because it's a Grails task and we're doing Grails run app. So technically I could go to here and say Grails run app, and it'll do the exact same thing that it's getting ready to do in the IDE. It's going to pull down some dependencies. If it has, it may not even have to because I did this earlier, so it's probably not even going to pull down. It may pull down dependencies if you don't already have them loaded and cached, kind of like npm will and everything else. But all right, so now the Grails app is running on localhost 8080, and if we went over, because this is a REST API, there's no web pages to go look at. But we can go over here and go ahead and run localhost 8080 and send a GET request. And this is what Grails is going to send back based on that initial request, is message telling you the environment it's running in, the app version, the Grails version, just some metadata about the application, how many controllers there are, what the names of those are, the different plugins that are installed and the plugin versions. So this is just kind of what you get by default, straight out of running the app. Not very useful for anything we want to do, obviously. So we're going to kill that and come back to IntelliJ. So what we want to do first is usually kind of start with, I need to store some data or I need to view some data, et cetera. And the way that Grails manages that is through domains. So we're actually going to create a new domain, but what we're going to do is actually create it from the command line, so you can see that Grails has some built-in generation stuff. So I'm just going to type Grails and get back to that Grails shell. And I'm going to say create domain, and I want to create a domain class. And let's call this domain class convention. All right, created them. So let's go back here, and if we look at our domains, remember it used this, oh, it didn't use that group thing. We'll come back to that. So here's our domain. So this is going to be something that winds up in the database. And some things we might want to say about a convention is a convention might have a name, a convention might have a description, start date, end date, right? So that's it. It's all you have to do. And this will, when we run it again, it will actually create a table called convention with those columns in the database, and it will use their types to determine the types to create in the database. So we can kind of see how that works. There is a configuration file, it's application.yml. And if we go down here, we have data source environment for the database. So we have different environments that you can specify in Grails, and you can create your own, or you can use the built-in one. So when we just run it, we're running in development mode. When we run our tests, it'll run in test with the test profile. And if we build to a production, or we can run it in production mode, it'll use different settings for production. So this is kind of nice to help us break apart our configuration based on where we're developing everything. Right now, this is using an in-memory database based on a database called H2. So if I run this right now, and again, this is no different than running it from the command line, it will provide me the ability to debug and things like that because I am in the IDE. But all right, it's running again. And another kind of cool thing that Grails provides is this BB console. So if we connect to this, did I connect to the right one? Hang on just a sec, I think I need to connect to a different one. Maybe. Is that the one that's in there? Okay, there we go. So now you can see I have a convention table with an ID version. So ID and version are automatic. Every domain that you create has an ID and a version included. You don't have to define it by default. You can override it if you want to. Version is for optimistic locking, so you know if somebody's updating a record that's already been updated and things like that. But then the other things are the stuff that I put in there. So description, end date, name, start date, and it provides some index information. So let's, yeah.
So you indicated that the database it used was
an in-memory database.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So why is that? Since MongoDB is part of, why are they using that?
So an in-memory database is just really, really fast for development. Generally, what will happen is you'll use an in-memory database to run all your tests against, because it spins up the database, and then when the JVM dies, the memory gets dumped, database goes away. We'll see in a little bit. I'm actually going to switch to a Postgres database, so you'll see us, doing that configuration, right? So if we wanted to actually load up some data into the database, there's this cool little file down here called Bootstrap. Bootstrap's init method init closure runs every time the app starts. So we could say new convention, and we can say name equals con. We can say description equals cool con. And I'm going to break this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to see. And we can say that the start date is new date and end date is new date plus 3. So we're going to add 3 days to the date. And then we actually want to save that. So what this is it's considered an active record pattern. So convention has, or all the domains have several methods on them. Find by methods, save methods, update methods, delete methods, and it's all talking over JPA, Hibernate, object relational mapping tool, etc. So that's all we have to do to actually save a record in the database. So let's run this again and make sure I didn't goof up. All right, so if we go back over here, I don't know if I can just refresh this or not. Find out. Apparently not. All right, so if we go into here now, and there's my data. So in terms of creating your tables, adding data, that's all there is to it. But it'd be nice if maybe we were a little more specific about how we want to store this data, right? So there are some sensible defaults that are built in, like nullable false being the default, and also the blank is true and different things like that. Links are going to be based on the database, whatever those defaults are going to be. So generally your varchars, which are your strings, are going to be 255, etc. But let's just say we want to do something special. So we're going to say that name, we don't want it to be false. So the difference between false and nullable is there's nothing there. Blank means it's an empty string, right? And we want conventions to have a unique name because we don't want multiple people adding conventions that have the same name. That would be confusing. And we don't want conventions with a name less than 5. And we don't want convention names that are more than 150 because that's kind of ridiculous, right? Description, maybe it's okay if it's nullable. And we'll do a min size of say 25, because if they do enter 1, we want something, actually for the sake of coding, I'm just going to say 5 again. Max size, though, we want to be able to enter some nice information if they want to. Start date and end date, we don't really need to do a whole lot with because they're dates, and they're going to be nullable by default. I personally like to go ahead and add them in to the constraints. Just A, if I need to add them later, it's less typing, and B, it helps with the order of things, with the JSON generation and different things like that. And what I'll show you in a little bit is when we're testing, having those there for testing purposes is very important. So if we run it again, and we'll refresh to come back in here. And we still get the data. But if we look at, let's see if I can look at the schema information here. I don't know if I can do it from this or not. No, not that. Do what?
Column names.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so if we look at description, now it's a varchar of 2000, name is 150 and it's not null. So you can see it's adding the constraints onto the table as well. So, the nice thing is that Grails actually provides validation prior to pushing out based on those constraints. So it will actually validate the data based on what you've specified, and then if everything passes, it will try and hit the database. But the database also has the constraints because what if something messed up, right? We want to be as safe as we can across the board. So we're creating RESTful APIs. It might be a good idea to figure out how to create an endpoint to actually access said API, right? So we do that with controllers. So we're going to come back here again, and we're going to create controller, and we're just going to type in convention again. And so now we end up with a convention controller. So this is where we're going to get all of our endpoints from. And my mouse here so I can type stuff correctly. All right, so response formats are going to be the different formats we want to be able to allow. JSON's going to be the default. We can get XML, which I'll show you how to do in a little bit. So if we go into the index method, we want to adjust this a little bit because we also kind of want to support paging. So we're going to pass in an integer max there, and then we're going to say params.max is equal to math.min max question mark. Again, this is Groovy stuff that's just kind of convenience methods, and we want to respond with convention.list, and we want to pass in params. All right, so this is some crazy stuff, right? So params is everything that's going to come in as part of the request for this particular thing, right? So if there's a max params passed in, we're going to do a max of 10 or a max of 100. And then when we do convention.list, again, this is active record. This is actually going to say select star from convention, and it's actually going to pass in anything in params that matches SQL with regards to paging. So max, order, all that stuff, right? Just by default. And then the other thing we need is we need to actually map that to the URL. So there's this URL mappings class. And I'm actually going to get rid of all this because we don't need that for the RESTful API. And what we need to do is we need to map the controller to a set of resources. So I want this to be an API. I want this to use pluralization of the resource. And the resources are going to be for convention. So what this does is it says for this URL mapping, when we access it as an endpoint, we're going to wire up resources for the convention controller. And it uses this as a convention. If our convention controller was called convention blah controller, that would not work. It has to match the name of the controller before the word controller, but it's lowercase and then camel cased. And what resources does is it basically provides us things like API/conventions. It provides us API/conventions with a post. This is actually with a get. It provides us with API conventions/ID for a get, update, delete, etc. It just provides all those out of the box without us having to worry about any of that manually, right? Let's go ahead and I'm going to make one more adjustment here just for the sake of, let's see, how do I want to do this loop? I always forget how to do these loops. All right, we're going to call this so this is another little Groovy stuff here. Basically what we're saying is there's, this is a closure, it's iterating 1 through 5. There's an it variable that's understood. It's kind of like this. It's going to be the index of that iteration. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to create concon1, concon2, concon3, concon4 whenever it loads, right? So let's go ahead and run this. When we're done, Russ is going to say, why didn't we do SASNAC and Grails?
You've already been saying.
I know. All right, so now we're going to go over here and we're going to say API/conventions. Another thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're passing in the appropriate content type and send. And I only got one. Oh, I did that wrong. Hang on. I did my loop wrong. All right, I don't remember what this is, so we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. Because I don't want to waste a lot of time going, I don't remember how to iterate over a stupid loop. I don't recommend this approach. There are better ways to load data. But we're going to do it this way because I need to save time. GenRocket is a very good way to load data. I'll show you in a little bit. You don't always have to stop and restart Grails. It has hot loading, so if you make changes, it'll automatically hot swap the changes into the class path. But if you're changing things like data loading and domain columns and stuff, it's usually, you want to stop it. But if you're just changing controller methods and service methods and stuff like that, you don't have to keep restarting it. All right, let's go try this again, see if we get to. Yeah, we got to. Okay. So there's our conventions. There's our data for getting a convention. If I said 1 here, 2, 1, hey, what's going on? All right, live coding, guys. This is what happens, right? That's actually interesting. Why is that not doing that? All right, well, let me show you another feature. If I do .xml on the end of this, now I get XML. See how easy it is? I mean, you could actually support both XML and JSON out of the box without having to make any changes to your code, which is actually pretty cool. Now it's going to bug me why this doesn't work. For days.
It's not because of the S.
No, it's not because of the
So
S.
that means that you made it, so that, is it quote one?
No, it shouldn't be quote. Let me make sure I type something right real quick in my URL mappings. API conventions, resources, convention. Why does that not want to work for me? Okay, normally that works. I can show you another app where it works perfectly. I don't know why it's not working here, but we'll move on and come back to that. I'm curious if the save will work though. Let's try save. What do you say? So let's post some raw data. And let's do description. And I don't need a comma there, do I? Let's do start date 2016-11-1. End date 2016-11-02. It's a very short convention. All right. And we want to post it to that. That's interesting why that's not working.
Is it trying to send a key?
No, not yet. I haven't done this.
Check
No, I haven't done the security stuff yet. Oh wait, what's checked?
key. Left down a little bit.
That?
Yeah.
No, that's just blank. That's just no. I don't know why that's not working. There's no authorization, headers, content type, application JSON, API convention, post, body. I can't find it, and I don't know why. And so we're just going to move forward, and I'll show you another working one at the end. So let's talk a little bit about relationships between domain objects, because obviously we're not going to be creating single objects in our database. So we have a convention, and we're just going to do the new Grails domain class from IntelliJ instead of command line this time, and we're going to call it event. And the event will have a string name, and for the sake of simplicity, we're not going to give it anything else. And so the relationship between convention and event would be a one-to-many, most likely, right? One convention, a whole lot of events. So the way we do that is we say, give it a map. So we say that convention has many events of type event. And to make this bidirectional, we say belongs to convention. So what that does for us is each event is going to have a foreign key to the convention in this class. And then that also provides cascades. So if I go and delete a convention, it's going to cascade and delete all of its events for us, right? So that's how easy it is to do a many-to-many. There's also has ones that you can do for a has one relationship, and you can also do many-to-many relationships, although they're done a little bit differently. And we'll see that whenever we add the security onto this. So let's go ahead and write a test for our convention. So we're going to use the unit test. And when we created the convention object, it went ahead and created an empty spot specification for us. And so we actually want to test something. We want to test constraints. Let me get rid of that. And then I'm going to copy and paste some code to save some typing time so that you guys can see it. So in Groovy, you don't have to type everything. It'll infer the types. So this is spot code, and again, I'm not going to go into super detail in it. But basically what it is doing, and we're just going to do main to save some time as well because we're running out of time. What it's basically saying is, given a new convention where the field is equal to the value, we're going to validate it. And then we're going to expect that for this field, we have a code that matches this error. Everybody kind of follow that?
I did not follow that.
Okay, so we created a new convention. So what we're kind of saying here is con.name equals blank. And we're expecting that when this happens to get this message back in this error code. This where clause does that for us based on these column names.
Oh, I see. So you have a way to map the different errors you want, different conditions.
Right.
Okay.
So we don't have to manually do it. So if we run this test, and we're going to run it as a unit test, it popped up on my other screen. Oh, hang on, that's not going to work because that getString method. Give me just a sec. All right, let's run that again. So our test passes because all of these were the expected outcomes. So for example, if I change this to 14, now it should fail because this would not result in an error. So you're kind of testing the opposite of the constraints, right? You're testing that the constraints are actually failing, and now what actually happened is we expected not met, and the error code came back null, which means it passed the validation, which is not what we want. So what this allows us to do is do negative testing to verify that if we change any of our constraints in the domains, and we run our integration or our automated tests, they'll fail as soon as we change that and didn't update the test, right? Now the other thing to notice about that is when we ran it as one test. When in reality, it's doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tests. So the way that we can tell it to do that as 5 tests is we can use this unroll annotation. So now when we run it, it'll actually report it as running 5 tests instead of just the 1. And you can see now we have 5 on the left instead of just the 1 green. Make some people happy when there's a whole bunch more tests that show up in the test reports. And technically, if you were doing this without Spock, these would be individual tests. So it makes more sense to unroll them. And these are unit tests, so it's mocking the convention. It's not actually using a database. It's doing everything in memory, so they run really, really fast, right? Any questions about any of the tests on that? The other thing we can actually test is we can test the constraint count. And the reason that the constraint count can be kind of an important test is you could add a constraint, and then if you don't test it, it never fails. So if somebody adds a constraint, but they forget to add the constraint test, it means they weren't in the test code in the first place, so they wouldn't know to update this. So we can say void test constraint count, and we can simply say, not that, simply say that we expect that convention dot constraint properties dot size is equal to, how many do we have? 6? 1, 2, oh, it's actually 4. So let's just run the entire test instead of just the individual test. So it'll run both of these. Oh, you did. You're right. We had 5, didn't we? See, we're already doing a better job because we're writing tests. All right, so now that passes, and that's really fast. So those are our unit tests for the actual. We can also write controller tests for the specification as well, which involves a lot of a little bit of mocking and different things like that. I'm going to pop this up here just to show it real quick. So the controller test, we're going to test for the controller. We're going to mock. I have some extra objects in here, but let's just worry about convention. And we basically say that when we call the controller index here, because we're not passing in empty data, we want to make sure that our response status is OK, which is an HTTP 200, and that our text that we get back is an empty array, which is accurate because we're returning JSON. I bet that is the security guy. Hello? Yeah, I'm going to send Wayne down, if that's all right. He'll grab them and come right back up. Thanks. Thanks, Wayne. Okay, I'll wait. If we want to test what actually happens when we do have data, we're using some service mocks here because we're using some service classes. We're creating the data. We're calling the index method again, and then we're expecting an OK and the size to be 100, and then we're just cleaning up when we're done. So let me go back to this real quick. The last thing I'll do is we're going to add security into this so you guys can see how easy it is to secure the application. So there's a plugin called Grails, or there's a plugin for Spring Security for Grails. Spring Security is a security plugin for the Spring framework. Since Grails is built on Spring, they have a Spring framework or Spring Security for Grails. Somebody took that plugin and created another plugin on top of it called Spring Security REST. So it does token-based authentication instead of form-based session authentication, right? And by default, it's going to use the JSON Web Token API and frameworks for that. So the way that we do that is we don't minimize everything, because that wouldn't be how we want to view everything. And I think I've got this backwards. This one needs to come down here. This one needs to go up here. Sorry about that, guys. So the way we manage our plugins is through the Gradle build system. So we just need to add something into here. So I'm going to go grab it out of my other one real quick to save some typing and lookup and whatnot. And then in order for for the project to know it's there, we just need to refresh our Gradle build system. IntelliJ, there's a way to do that from the command line too, but we're just going to do it from IntelliJ. And so now that pulled in that plugin for us. So if we go back now into here, we have to actually exit it and restart it because we installed something else. We have a new command we can run from Grails related to the Spring security stuff. And it's called S2 Quick Start. And so we're going to define some security models that we need. So we want to store the user data in the user table. We want to store role data in the role table. And we want to put it in the con.api security package. Okay, so that all got taken care of. So if we go look up here now, and synchronize, where did it go? Why am I in the wrong thing? Where did they wind up? Grails. Oh, you guys will laugh at me again here in a minute. Hang on. I did that in the backwards order. Give me just a second. We actually need to do, let's do this backwards. Package first, then this stuff. Sorry about that. There we go. I'm going to delete this because that's where they went the first time. I actually did that earlier today too. I said, don't do that. So this creates a user object for us. Username, password, enabled, all this cool stuff, right? Creates a role for us, which is just going to store an authority. And then this is how it defines the many-to-many table. So many users can have many roles. And then it basically says that, where's my mapping? The ID is actually a composite of user and role, so it doesn't have its own ID, and we don't need to version join tables. So this is just going to create a join table for us between the two objects for the many-to-many. So let's go into Bootstrap and create some data for that real quick. And again, I'm going to copy and paste to save some time. I need to import these, import that, and import that. So we create a new role called role user. We create a new user with a username of user1 and a password of pass1, which will get encrypted. We're going to save that user, and then we're going to create a user role with this user and this role. This true just means flush this when it's done, so it commits the transactions. We don't have to worry about stuff not getting written to the database. And then the only other thing we really have to do is this adds an application.groovy file, which adds, this is all the configuration for Spring Security to work. And it's in here twice because I ran it twice, so I got to delete one of them. Only thing we need to add is the appropriate filter chain for the URL where we want to match the API to work on. So I'm not going to get into the minutiae of what this filter chain does, but it's basically when a request is made, it's got to process through a bunch of servlet filters in order to figure out exactly, what to do for the chain of command. So now let's run this again. And so you can see that it started up the Spring Security core, it configured the Spring Security REST, and now it's running. So if we go back to Postman, and it has a built-in login at API/login. We're actually going to post JSON data to it. We're going to pass our login credentials. And pass one, and the rest of this will go away. And we want to make sure we're doing application JSON. So when we send this in, now we get back this really cool access token and refresh token, which is part of token-based authentication. Our access token is what we're going to send in every single time into the request. This is the whole stateless aspect, so that the backend can say your access token is valid. So this access token is made up of 3 chunks. You guys can look up JWT when you're at home. The first chunk is information about the token when it expires. The second chunk is some public data about roles and different things like that. And then the third piece is the actual encryption piece that's private, that can't be unencrypted without the key. And all that stuff's already kind of built into the system by default. And so we need to copy this. And we're going to go into our convention controller. And we're going to say at secured, or we're going to say role user. So now what we're saying is everything inside the convention controller has to have authentication come in as role with a role of user in order to be able to access that data. So if we go back over to this get, we run this now, we get a 401 unauthorized, which is accurate, right? Because we don't want anybody to have access to that. So if we add X authorization bearer, and our, that's not our key, I didn't copy it. Oh, I recopied, didn't I? Let's run this again real quick. Copy all that. Authorization error. Now we, and let me make sure that X authorization is the right thing real quick, because I usually type that wrong as well. Just a sec, guys. Did this earlier and I already forgot. I've slept since then. Oh. No, that's, maybe I was completely off. I didn't think it was X auth token, but we'll try it and see. No, it's not X auth token, that's the wrong thing. Where is it at? Where is it at? Where is it at? Oh, it's just authorization by itself, isn't it? I'm probably thinking of. Okay, now it authorized correctly, so it brought back the data. And if we went into the convention controller, we're going to see if this actually works, because and we said that role admin, for example, which this is kind of backwards, right? We're going to do this anyway. Notice that it reloaded that file. So if we go back here now, that token is only for role user, so it doesn't work anymore. And if we go back here and change this back to role user, for it to reload. Now it works again. So there's a whole bunch of different configuration you can hook up into this. Logout's not technically supported out of the gate because you don't log out of token authentication, they expire, or you can force their expiration. But you can configure it to support logging out as well if you wanted to. And you can support different token-based authentication. You can do social, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff as well. And it's got really good documentation on how to configure all that. But out of the box, it's basically installing the plugin, running the S2 Quick Start, and adding that servlet, the little filter chain. And for the most part, it works pretty much like you expect it to work. Any questions about the security? So what I can do real quick is kind of show the more fleshed out application and their domain. So at the high level here, we have an organization. The organization belongs to a user and has many conventions. Our convention looks pretty similar, except now it belongs to an organization, has many events. And our event belongs to a convention. And I had started working on adding location and different things like that. And then the other kind of thing to key in on here is generally in Grails, whenever you're doing your database, transactional data and business logic, you want to use services instead of doing everything directly in the controller. So you can create a service, and a convention service, it doesn't really matter what it's named. Transactional up here just means everything is going to be transactional. And then to use that service, all we have to do is define it in our controller, and it uses dependency injection to inject it in there for us. And in fact, we didn't really even have to do this. You could have defined it like that as well, because Groovy's groovy like that. Let you do things untyped. And because this name is camel case with a lowercase, the same as that is named, it finds it and injects it into the controller for us. The namespace stuff allows us to define our URL mappings so that we can separate our administrative controller resources and our, say, public API. So you may want to provide a way for anybody to go list all your conventions, but you only want administrators to be able to create them and manage them and things like that. And so if you put these inside a different package and then you namespace them as admin, then when you're creating your resources, notice that this and this is the same. It uses the namespace so that Grails knows which one to use for which controller. Because without that, you would have to name it admin, convention controller, and different things, and that's just ugly, right? So your namespaces can separate different, and it could be admin, it could be different role levels and different things like that. It really doesn't matter. And from there, it's just a matter of the idiosyncrasies of managing the data. The other thing is by default, you're getting that JSON view you saw. You can customize that. So for example, I created a template here for the convention that's only going to return the ID and the name. And when I call the controller's index method, because this is index.json, it tells it to render that convention's template, which it defines a template because of the underscore. And so it uses that to render the JSON instead of the default object, which is just going to render all the properties of the class. And then you can define it for each method in your controller. You can define a different way that that might get rendered. You can actually control that from the controller as well. Your errors all come back as JSON or XML depending on what you're doing. So it's super easy to customize and make it do whatever you need it to do, basically. And again, this is all using Spring Boot under the hood and Spring in the Spring framework. So when you see the controllers, they're really no different than the controllers for the Spring MVC framework. And you're seeing the domains are no different than the entities you're creating. Services are services. It's just with the Groovy convention over configuration and some of the meta programming that's involved, it could just wire everything up for you so it's less typing. Any questions, comments? I knew something wasn't going to work. I know, and I'll go home tonight and it'll work, and I'll have no idea why. I can run this one. I actually have security turned off. It's pretty easy if you just want to disable security for whatever reason. Say active false, and then I'll actually see this one actually pulling back the data. I probably typoed something wrong. All right, so we'll go back to here, and we're not going to worry about that. So if I do this, we get one. There's only one convention, but notice, remember that in those JSON files, I'm telling it to only render the ID and the name. If I say 1, I get 1 back. It does work. I don't know why the other one didn't, right? And then I wonder if, not the login, does this still have it? Let's see if this works. That one still didn't work for some reason. It was working the other day. I'll figure that out. Anyway. But that's, what I demoed is a big chunk of Grails and how it works. It's creating domains, it's creating controllers, and creating services. And your domains just have those very simple relationships. The has many, belongs to, cascading just works. Everything can be customized. For example, in the user table, Postgres user is a keyword, and so it wants to create table name is based off the name of the class. So normally it would create user, but since user is a keyword in Postgres, that would fail. We can go into this mapping closure, and we can tell it we want our table to be named something else. We want our password to be named something else. We want to provide all sorts of different information, about all of the different columns of that. So you can actually, in fact, at Markel, what we were doing is we had a mapping block for every single domain because we had to map everything to legacy database tables that weren't in the GORM Grails structure, right? So we had mappings and all the columns were different than what we were naming the field properties and everything. It was kind of a pain, but it supports, databases that it's not creating. Because when you run this, because of this configuration here, it's basically saying when you run, create the database. When you're done, drop the database. You can also just do update. So if it's not there, it'll create it, but it won't destroy it when you're done. And then whenever you run it again, it'll just make changes. Now, it's not going to drop columns and drop tables, but it will add columns and make changes to columns and things like that and add new tables and columns. If you wanted to do Postgres, for example, instead of the in-memory database, it's just changing this information here. Call it the URL. And this is all JDBC based, username, password, the driver class name from the JDBC driver that you're using, and then the dialect, so Hibernate knows what kind of SQL to generate for the database. And then now you're talking to a Postgres database instead of the in-memory database. And the production one's actually doing in-memory, but it's passing in some additional properties. Sometimes this is important with databases for keep alive and different things like that. And it actually does do the pooled true, so it actually creates a connection pool to choose from, which is faster than just single connections, etc. So scalable, robust, runs on the JVM, so anywhere Java runs, the stuff will run. And that's it.
Thank
Yep, that's right.